Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Bad Girls Guide. And today we'll be talking about relationships. So, Bad Girls Guide is for Traffic MD, which is a wellness where you have consultations about how to optimize your wellness and your health and reverse chronic disease. So, the Bad Girls Guide to Living Well is a place where we can talk about all of the different aspects of health and how you can, misbehave a little bit and still not completely ruin your health. Now, today I have someone on who is, if I needed a body buried on the East Coast, this is the person that I would call. And if it was the West Coast, the only reason I wouldn't call her is because of logistics of getting there in time. So today my guest is Dr. Anna Kate Cassio, and she sat next to me all through medical school, and we have been as far north together as Denali National Park in Alaska and as far south as the South Island of New Zealand. We're having a little bit of a technical issue, but she'll be able to sign on directly. So she and I have been very, very close for about 17 years. Our lives have mirrored each other in some interesting ways. There she is. So you might want to unmute on the side so we can hear you. Can you hear us? You can. So what we're going to talk about today is toxic relationships.
I can hear you great.
Perfect. Good. And welcome to the show, Dr. Anna Kate Cassio.
Thank you very much.
All right. So I was just giving a little bit of your bio as far as where our history is. I didn't do anything professional, just that I would call you if I needed to bury a body. We've been from Denali to the South Island of New Zealand. And we sat next to each other every day through medical school. And I didn't mention that we've been to most of the states together because we did a month-long road trip, southern route across the states, up the northern, eastern seaboard, and then across to the Grand Tetons, and then down through Utah back to Arizona, right?
Well, big oval.
It was a big oval. It was really good. And so,
fun oval.
And I quoted you last week, actually, about saying that you never return from a trip the same.
Right.
Because I talked about my trip to Egypt a lot. And you're actually who I stole that from, because we've gone through a lot of transitions and journeys together over the 17 years that we've known each other. I know we're a long time.
17. I hadn't stopped to do the math.
So I will say that through our relationship, and how inseparable that we have been. I've always been the bad one, and you've always been the good one. And
I am the good one.
Yeah, you are the good one. And so I thought it was going to be interesting today to talk about how, even though I'm the bad one and you're the good one, our current situations have been mirroring each other very similarly. And I wanted to talk about how we've dealt with things similarly yet differently, and yet even though we are very different, we've done a lot of things together. I think that our relationship is one of the healthiest that I've ever had, and like that kind of guidepost as far as what is not toxic and what is loving and supportive always is a good place to start as far as like what you are looking for in a relationship, because I know that I've done things that you're like, really? And yet you've loved me still with non-judgment through the whole way, right?
Right, absolutely, absolutely. And I think to add on to that, I think if we're looking at a healthy relationships, if we're looking at relationships that work, one of the big things that I think is crucial and often overlooked is the chance for both people to evolve, and not necessarily at the same tempo. I think that change is a really easy thing for people to say, oh, no, I don't want to change. This has been my same, BFF since I was 3. And then there's a stagnation because this used to be the little girl who'd pull your hair and not eat peas. And then when she's 40 and she's eating peas, and you know what I mean? You have to give the chance to evolve, and lovingly, and maybe not at the moment that you're evolving, or that other people in your healthy relationship group might be evolving.
Or people think that you should be evolving.
Exactly. I think that you see that come into play in the biggest example I can think of is when women start having children, and then the friends that they have, when the relationship begins to be a little, the equilibrium gets a little, the Spanish word is chueco, you get a little off kilter. You hear the quick, well, she's got kids, well, she's in mom mode, or, well, she doesn't know, she doesn't have kids, like there, all of a sudden there's this acceptance to be on different levels. And then it's, where do you take that? I mean, can you say, well, she doesn't have kids, she called at 8:00, that's midnight now in my world, or the opposite.
I think that having a place of safety is really important, right? And so then there's this perspective where you can understand that people are going to be different, but then also I don't know, because there's an expectation that things will change, but then you don't want to put a caveat saying, well, I'm not going to love you unless you change because I'm judging you about
good point
this. And so, like, I know that a lot of times people will put their own agendas or their own, high horse perspectives as far as like, well, I am judging you about this and I think that you should change. And that's a dangerous place to be because, like, you can have different opinions about that, right?
Yeah, I think the word should is something that might be, a flag on the field when you think about, are you in a toxic relationship? Are you surrounding yourself with, I think going back to your word safe is really a wise word to use, because when you feel safe, one, you can be authentic. You're nobody, your little light inside. I go into that song from grade school of don't let anybody it out. I'm going to let it shine. So if your light is safe, then you can let it shine. You can let it out in any direction. And it makes me think that, I hadn't made a parallel or a line leaping the word faith to those fairly pejorative words. You should do this. If you wanted to do this, you should do this. Mm-hmm. But that might be, and I don't have the answers, but that might be a flag when you to earmark, gosh, is this relationship letting it be safe for me to be me?
Mm-hmm. Because it's not, people aren't friends with you if they think that you should change yourself in a fundamental way to make them happier, I think.
Absolutely.
I've seen this in relationships, and I've been in some really toxic, like romantic relationships, as far as how that was all set up in, dating a narcissist or 5, 0, it's my safe place, just kidding. But having the way that they try to control your like actions and, make you feel like, oh, you really should be doing better about this. Like you can totally do better, or you did this wrong and I'm so injured about it now. Like that's so classic. And I've seen it in, clients and, patients that I've had, as far as, they're like, well, I know that I, shouldn't eat sugar at night, but I did. And, now my significant other is mad at me and he's telling me that I'm not doing, my life as well as I should be doing. And it's like, holy shit, like, is that love? Like, that is not a safe place. Like, should we be eating a bunch of sugar at night? Probably not, like, ultimately, but really, is it such a big deal in the grand scheme of things to withhold love about? And I think that it's really very common. Like, have you worked out enough? Like, there's this kind of like health Nazism that people get really judgy about. And I guess that's something that hits me a little bit closely, because I feel like I've had a lot of love withheld from me because I'm not perfect.
Thank goodness.
Ugh, how boring would that shit be? Whew. Right?
Well,
Right?
I mean, to say on the other side of where that could be coming from, I do think there is an element of with exercise. I mean, using exercise as the specific, there is an endorphins. I mean, there is that sense when you're exercising that you feel so good that you're like, oh, come on, come with me. But,
Yeah.
and I've seen that in my practice where I've had primarily husband and wife. One of them will start coming to me and feeling better and eating more protein in the morning and getting in there, however many steps those gizmos count.
Mm-hmm.
And then they start pushing their spouse, who may also be my patient, and that spouse can only handle about 8 minutes of this conversation, and then they're over it. They're like, my show's on, I'm done. I gotta make a Pop-Tart or whatever the thing is. But I have to say that there are times where that encouragement comes from a place of betterment and to help your partner evolve. And again, my ear just now picked it up as you said it, when you said the word should. Again, the should is like your rules to your life function in a beautiful symphony in your space. But as soon as somebody else's rules or their own symphony gets shoulded onto you, it doesn't fit. It's so interesting. I hadn't heard, I mean, the word should is like blared. It was like the volume went really loud right when you said that.
Ryan used to say, don't should all over me.
Don't should all over me.
I think it's really good.
Yeah, it should be like a sad face, the big yellow sad face, and it should say, should happens.
Right, should happens. Yeah, because it's really it has a lot of judginess in a way.
Very pejorative. Yeah.
I know more about how you should live your life than you do. And I think, it's kind of an easy thing to do because you want what's best. Like, I think that another piece of this is like, I want what's absolutely best for the people that I love. Now, do I know exactly what that is for them? No. But sometimes when you see those red flags and you're like, that's going to be a rough one, right? Like, I know that I've sat back in judgment at certain times and been like, oh, that's bad, with different relationships, but it's not my life.
Yeah.
And it's not up to me. And it doesn't mean that I loved that person any less. And you know what? Maybe I'm right. Maybe I'm wrong, really. And when it comes down to it, it has nothing to do with me.
Right. It's your perspective. And I think that's another very interesting pillar to look at under the umbrella of toxic relationships, whether at any realm that you involve yourself in a toxic relationship. I think that that's an important thing, that there's a very different perspective when you're a bystander versus when you're in it. And it does seem to me, in the years that I've endured in the toxic relationships that have come and gone, that there is an understanding that can come and a compassion that is fairly easy to tap into once you've been in a toxic relationship, because you can really take that muscle memory or that skill set of empathy and compassion, and you can kind of shift it to anything, whether it's a mom that's more of a toxic situation, a boss, a husband, a good girlfriend. Like, it's an overlay that fits in any way, because the toxicity is, I think, once you endure it, they say the same thing for a gallstone. Like, once you go through it, you're like, this is gallstone pain. But up until then, you can't always put your finger on it. You can't always say, oh yeah, this is a toxic relationship.
Sorry. I think someone wants to dye eggs for Easter.
That's funny.
So I think it's really interesting. When I did the battered women and children office, when I first became a practitioner, I think that was good perspective to see, from the outside. And then when you go through it and like there's a separation where you're like, well, how did this happen to these women? Right? Like, how did this happen? And then but when it happens to you, and you find yourself all of a sudden, you're like, holy shit, I'm in an unhealthy relationship. I'm a professional person. I'm well educated. I've considered myself strong. Like, how did this happen to me? And it's very insidious. And I think that it happens to more people than really are able to know or understand, because it can be so insidious. And so then once it does happen to you and you catch it, you're like, whoa, then it's a lot better and you're more able to understand and have the empathy. I completely agree with
And
that.
on that, just as you're saying that, what also makes me realize is that there's an insidiousness that often happens. I mean, we don't meet these toxic guys and be like, hubba, I'm taking him home. Like, there's an element, you know what I mean? There's an element where that comes out over time. And I think in any relationship, but I also think what's interesting is then our choices. So you're saying, like, how did I get, the idea of how did I get here? I'm educated. I'm a professional. Even uneducated, I feel like I've got common sense. I've got my head screwed on. I make decisions primarily with my heart, so I feel really grounded when it comes to this. And finding myself in toxic relationships, I think there's another piece, another element to what you're saying, in that not only can we cultivate compassion once we've endured it, but we're more likely to say and be compassionate vocally if we got out of it. And that choice, I think, is not always a choice that's feasible. I think there are times where you are maybe given the lesson of are you tough or are you resilient? The difference is being, I always thought I wanted to be tough. I want to be tough. I want to, sleep with the moose in Alaska and carry a knife in my cowgirl boot. But I've changed my mind. I've evolved on this. So evolve with me. But or don't, I don't care. But the thing is I'm thinking now is I don't really want to be tough anymore. I like my soft parts. I like the fact that I can't listen to hard stories on the news, but I do find tremendous comfort in knowing how resilient I am. And I think that part of that for me came by making that decision to exit toxic relationships. And it makes me think of the people that I think of, or situations that I've heard of where people might be in a toxic relationship, can recognize it, maybe or maybe not. And then what do they choose to do with that information? Or what can they do?
So let's talk about, how do you recognize it?
Yeah.
As far as like clinically, in your opinion, how would you say, based on all of the experience that you have inside out, how would you say that you could recognize it? Because I think that's a hugely important part, because, I mean, I just recognized one of the biggest ones in my whole entire life really is like, woof, recently, and I'm not a spring chicken, right? So it's like, how do you recognize it? What are some signs that you would say?
I wish I had like a little checklist. I probably have it laminated and in several colors, but I don't. And I think it's going to be very individualized. I think it's going to be one of those things where you look for different markers in different areas. I think one is a sense where looking at the whole terrain of the relationship and not making it any one thing, but looking at the whole terrain of the relationship and seeing when this being comes into my space, do the other people leave? Like, is there a sense of, woo, and I think that can be, I think looking back, when I found myself in more toxic relationships, I also find myself alone. And I'm not really an alone person. I usually have, different groups of friends in different capacities in different venues, throughout. Like, all my friends aren't friends.
They can separate you out from your base of support. That's a big one, I think.
It's like the Serengeti. Like, pick on the one that's by himself.
Mm-hmm. Makes you weaker.
Yeah, and it does. Absolutely. Absolutely. I think a sense of isolation. And I think clinically, in my practice, it's taken me a long time to figure out the vernacular to use to spot it in my patient base. Because I don't know, I'm not seeing them in a social
Right.
coffee house environment. I'm seeing them in a clinical, hour long or so appointment. But there are times where you hear, well, she doesn't hang out with me anymore, or a name that I used to hear a lot, and they're gone. And they're gone because they had a blow up with a new dude. And that to me is, like I said before, like a flag on the field, like, let's put that tick mark on. But I do think inherently there's an insidiousness that works against the idea of having a list, a laminated, color coded list of things to watch for. But what do you see as far as, what do you think are markers?
Like that when someone walks in a room and you just feel on edge and stressed and like drained, or you could do the wrong thing and set them off, right? Like that walking on eggshells kind of feeling, I think, as far as like, well, I don't want to upset this person, so I'm going to modify my behavior to make them more comfortable.
Right.
I think that's one. And I've done that many times. So I think I can recognize that one as far as just being like, we don't want to upset this person. So, and I've just kind of finished like dampening myself down to make some other people more comfortable because they don't like me at full volume. And you know what? That's okay. I'm not going to go out that full volume, But that hostility or that walking on eggshells, lack
So
of.
can I ask a question in here? Yeah. Because I think this spurs for me something that I don't have the answer to. I have not wrapped my brain around the idea that, I mean, you say the sentence, what I'm catching up is what you say the sentence, they can't keep up with my full volume. Like I'm dampening my unique, sparkly specialness because I'm in the company of somebody else. And how do you see that? How do you see that from an outside perspective? Like, I mean, I know I've been there, I know it, but how do you feel that manifests in the physical world?
I don't know, maybe it would be like comments about the way people look, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like I had a girlfriend that was sitting in a booth with her husband, and she was just like sitting there dancing and singing, and he was like, "Oof, you are so show-offy." And I remember she texted me that, and I was like, "Whoa, yikes!" Right? Or, are you really wearing that? Within reason. Like there's maybe like that external version of like what they're comfortable with you being from a physical perspective. I think that hypercriticism professionally, though, too, is something where they don't take joy in your successes.
Absolutely. I see that. Yep.
I think that that could be one because there's an underlying jealousy, right? Or an underlying insecurity. And I think that this happens across the board. Like I can totally see this happening with parents, 100%, siblings, loved ones, friends, whatever, family.
I think that's the thing that made me so interested when you said that we were going to talk about toxic relationships. I think what I can get so engaged in is how they are absolutely everywhere. And, because I'm the good one, I think they're also folks that you can have a toxic relationship with that can turn around and have a non-toxic relationship with somebody else. What do you think of that?
Right. It's because we were talking about like, how do you recognize them? And then what do you do about them? And I remember one of the things, like I remember this from 17 years ago, where something happened when we were at school and I looked at that person and I was like, ooh, bad news, cut out of my life. Don't ever want them near me. Done. Light that bitch on fire.
But what did we learn?
And what you said was, it's just data.
Just data.
Right. And I remember thinking, like, really? I don't have to light that shit on fire? It's like two different ways of dealing with it. But I mean, it really is. And because I think that you come from a place of, and she didn't do anything to either one of us.
Right. Yeah. We should say neither one of us were even in the periphery of the drama. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But it was hard because we were friends with both sides of the drama. And yet it's just data. It's just information. And I think that at that period of time was a very helpful way to look at it, because for me, it was very balancing, very centering, that sort of like grounded place that I like to be operating from. And it promoted that. It promoted the, well, yeah. And you know what? It's not mine. It's not mine. I don't need to get it on me, and I don't need to make any absolute definitive decisions about it. Partly because you and I both were, uninvolved. Yeah, outsiders.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's like, you took it as data, like, okay, that's data. And I took it as data, like, that is not something I'm ever opening myself up to. And that might have been my loss in many different ways. Yeah, maybe. So I love how we look at things from different perspectives, because I think that's, there needs to be diversity.
Yeah.
And so if there's constant judgment, I think that's another thing. Like if it's constant judgment where the shoulding, that's another sign, I think, as far as there being a toxicity or expecting you to be perfect. Like that's where I come from. I come from a place where I was expected to always be perfect. Always striving, always needs to be better, always. And so then that from, so how do we come into these toxic relationships that feel like they're okay, or they feel like they're home, or like there's something broken in us that recognizes that as, feeling comfortable. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, like the strive for perfection or the judgment, the toxicity can come, I think, in some ways sort of nodding to the idea that this comes from the family of origin. It does then make that familiar. It makes it comfortable. It makes literally an unsafe place feel safe, which is only going to make a toxic relationship all the more insidious.
Right. And so I think that at this point, like, so what do you do? So if even if like, my sister talks to me like that, it makes me feel really badly. So then what do you do? I mean, my perspective is usually to cut that person out of my life and just be like, done, right? Which isn't always, and which I'm, still doing, but it isn't always the most loving thing to do, or the thing where you can grow together well. And you have a different way of dealing with it.
Excuse me, there is sort of the idea in my mind, it's like the middle path. Now, in the toxic relationships that I've personally experienced, I tend to be the backer-upper, the one that is like, does it really matter? Because I have this vision of the horizon line. I have this vision, like long-term, big picture, does this issue really matter? 99% of the time, the answer is probably not. Does that end up helping me? Probably not. I mean, I think it helps me not fly off the handle and be this even-keeled customer, but at the same time, I think it, pushes a level of how much am I going to put up with? And then all of a sudden, when is there a kindness and a retreating that is possibly also giving a signal of weakness or susceptibility, and I don't have those answers. And I think in this decade of my life, this is something I'm learning and getting perspective on. And I think it's hard to, in as it all comes to balance, it's hard to tell, but I think there is a little bit of a difference when you can't recognize it, when you can't see it for what it is in the clarity of being, while being in it, you know, in that moment. It seems so often, and speaking with people who have exited toxic relationships, primarily marriages or you know, life partners, they didn't see the level of exhaustion or toxicity or judgment until they left it, until there was the vacuum of it, until it was missing and there was peace.
Yeah, that exhaustion, I think, is a big piece. Like when you're exhausted by being with somebody, right? Like that's a really good indicator. Because, I mean, obviously in relationships, there has to be a give and take. There has to be communication. There has to be evolution together. There has to be, you know, a safe place where you can talk about stuff that, you know, upsets you or, you know, makes you not feel great. And so that always has to be present. And that communication aspect is really big, you know. And I know that there's times when, you know, people have come to you or come to me and been like, well, this, you know, this is upsetting me and I'd like to talk about it and, you know, talk about your behavior or what you did or this or that. And I think that's a really important thing to do, to be open to, so that you know that you're not, you know, hurting the other person. But it's a fine line too to recognize, well, is it, you know, it's probably nobody's fault unless you're dealing with a psychopath, narcissist, you know, controlling maniac, which been there. But how, you know, how do you draw that line between, you know, well, I feel bad about this. Is this something that I just cut and run from, or is it something that I build on? And that's a tough decision to make. I mean, relationships are so incredibly complicated, right? Like,
Right.
so if I'm doing this thing that makes this person unhappy, do I try to change that and, you know, heal the relationship or make them more comfortable? If it's one thing, what if it's 5 things? What if it's 50 things? And so, like, how do you know? And I don't think that we know the answer, right? Because this is the fundamental issue with relationships is, you know, how do you grow together? How do you nurture each other? How do you create a community of safeness while still allowing the other person to change and yet be themselves and evolve? I mean, that's a secret, right?
I hope it's not a secret. I hope it's wisdom that comes. That's what I hope. But it reminds me of, do you remember watching Mr. Rogers? Did you ever watch Mr. Rogers?
Oh yeah, I got a letter from him.
That is cool.
Mm-hmm.
He says, and I have a little Mr. Rogers quote that made me think of. He said, I don't think anyone can grow unless he is loved exactly as he is now, appreciated for what he is rather than what he can become. Pretty cool, huh?
He was the best of men.
Yeah, right? So they have this, I found this little sign. I took a picture. It's on my little phone. And I took a picture of it because I feel like it fills you. You know, it can make you stand taller, and I think that might be I don't know that the answer is a secret, but that might be a piece of it. You know, the Beatles saying all you need is love. But I think true I want to say unconditional love, but I think that phrase has sort of been beaten to death. But that idea of just pure love, like just loving and sending it out there is a very helpful start.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that having the empathy for, even if you have conflict with someone, like stepping back and recognizing where they're coming from, and just holding, I mean, because if we're in a relationship, we have loved that person in some capacity, right? I mean, coworkers, bosses, that's a little bit different, but maybe, I mean, you can have great working relationships with people and may not be like romantic love or whatever, but you can have good rapport with people and love them, but, and still have things go sideways in the end. But that kind of detached, just wanting what's best for somebody else, like want just covering them with love. There was something that came through on my email this morning where I get my inspirational morning emails from the universe. And it was about envision someone that you love totally, right? Or this that you just love. And then just envision them being showered and showered and showered and showered with love from you. And then now envision yourself being showered with love from the universe. And it's just like, how could you not just blossom under that? Right?
That's awesome.
It was good. It was a good one.
Yeah, that's really good.
And I think it's also a tough line to draw as far as how much do you love somebody while they're being toxic to you?
Yeah. And when I think that, and then how much do you love them? And at what point can you identify you investing, you maybe changing yourself for this person or not doing whatever the triggers are? How much are you maybe then taking away from your own sparkle and your own soul's path and your own vitality? And I think that's a call everyone who has the recognition that they're in a toxic relationship then has to chew on until they get all the flavor out of it. Because I think it's going to be different per person, per toxic engagement, and per time in your life. There's times in your life where it's easier to say, and I'm out. And there's times in your life where you may not have that.
Right. Right. I mean, there's...
Excuse me.
Oh, of course, we can't always just burn down everything.
Oh, I know that's probably very disheartening for you to hear.
A little bit.
Yeah, some of us, even when it's so fun to be incendiary, there are times I think, I was going to say before that there are times where it's wonderful to think of a relationship and then the word that I've come up with is you press pause. And it's actually a little bit of wisdom from my mom, who had great friends growing up. And then basically she had kids at a different time than all her friends had kids. And one of the things I remember her saying is just press pause. Just press pause. Don't make any absolutes. Press pause. Go do your own thing and be open to opening the door. And I think in my years, I've seen that work beautifully. There have been times where I've had great relationships and then it starts to not be so hot and you just press pause. I mean, maybe it's that same, under the same umbrella of it's just data. And I think it's an easier way to go about it, but can it be taken to an extreme and then you find yourself kind of trading somebody's happiness for a piece of your soul, and can you even see that in the moment of when it happens? That's the hard part.
Right.
Or one of the hard parts.
Now, you shared a story with me about your eldest daughter's experience recently. Would you share that with us?
Yes.
So I think it's really important to see, like, how do we stop? So if so much of this comes from the family of origin, where, we've got these programs that are operating, how do we make it so that our children are able to recognize toxic relationships, have good boundaries for them, et cetera? So just to frame that a little bit.
So I have a first grader and, well, of course, I think she's pretty fabulous. And she had sort of a tenuous time with another little girl in her class. And she would come home some days and say, so-and-so is a little unkind. Our word is ugly. So-and-so was a little ugly to me today. And we'd talk it out. And then I basically would say, well, let's concentrate on the people that make you laugh. And so she would, the bulk of the people in her little classroom, we would sort of focus. What we would do is move our attention. We're not going to pay attention to this little girl. We're going to pay attention to the other fun things that happen. And don't sort of focus on that, was sort of how we addressed it. And then one day she got off the bus all lit up, so excited. And she said, this little girl, she's my friend. And I said, oh, really? And of course, alarm bells are going off like wildfire in my head.
I've known that girl.
Yeah. And I think, oh man, but I'm excited. I mean, she's lit up. She's thrilled. She's got this little friend now. And so I said, I don't want to feed the situation that it's going to turn ugly. I certainly don't want to perpetuate anything. Excuse me. And so I said, well, some friendships take more work than others. And it seems to me that this friendship might take a lot of work. So I want you to be open to that before you get really excited. And I think we said we were jumping in puddles as we were walking back that particular day from the bus. So I said, so we kind of made the analogy of jumping in with both feet into the puddle. So we've had a couple of sweet weeks. The guys are buddies. They bring home little notes from each other. I saw her and her mom and got the contact information. They want a play date. Nothing has been set up. This is, first grade. Things move fast. And this week, my little girl got off the bus and said, well, you were right. And I said, what was I right about? And she said, this little girl doesn't want to be my friend anymore. And I said, well, we don't know that. So we talk about, well, what happened is this little girl having a birthday party, gave my daughter an invitation at 8, whatever this morning. And by the time they left, by the end of the day, took the invitation back home with her. And now my little girl's like, I think I'm invited. I mean, she's 7. Like, she's like, I think I'm invited. I'm not sure if I'm invited. I'm not sure if we're friends. There's so many questions. And so there's a part of me, the mama bear, wants to, get a hold of that mom and be like, look, we're either invited or we're not invited. But this is what's going on. But I also, it's interesting because I see the flags on the field, right? I see these markers. Right. Oh no,
like the drama. That's another really big one, right? Like that, save the drama for your mama. God.
Yeah, the roller coaster.
Exactly. Get off. That's another good sign. But go on.
Yeah. And so I don't know how to proceed. The thing I've got going for me is that she's 7, and by the time we got home, I had a surprise for her, and she forgot all about it. But we'll see where that goes, because as her greatest defender, I want to get in there and regulate. And yet I want her to learn how to navigate these situations. I want her to be able to pilot herself through high maintenance friends and high drama situations with ease so that they don't pull her down. I think she's a natural born empath. And so I think in some ways this is a skill set that she's going to rely on.
Right.
And I remember gardening with one of my friends who's in her late 70s. And we were talking about just friends and how beautiful it is to surround yourself with loving friends. And she said, well, the trick is finding the loving friends versus the high maintenance friends. And I know exactly what she was talking about. And she said, I used to say I could only have one high maintenance friend at a time. And I remember in medical school being told that we can only have one, I can't even remember, borderline personality, clinically diagnosed borderline personality patient at a time, because it's so exhausting.
I must have blocked that out because I want 0.
Yeah, well, hey. But the thing is I thought about, gosh, wouldn't it be neat to think about the friends that you have around you as being like, well, I can take on somebody high maintenance now, or you know what, I choose not to take on anybody high maintenance. Like, to have that absolute choice, mm-hmm. and to somehow instill that in a 7-year-old is where I keep looking for that manual that came with motherhood, and I have not yet found out where I put it.
Right.
But I like it.
Which brings up, it's an interesting piece though too. Fast forward 35 years, and how do you instill that, self-awareness and resilience so that children that grow into adults don't have toxic relationships with themselves?
Yes.
I think is one thing that I wanted to bring up that I haven't until now, because I find that, depending on your family culture and depending on your history and your personality, like, I am just exiting out of a range of toxic behaviors for myself. And I think that, And that can be addictions, that can be, like whatever sort of relationships you're allowing yourself to be in, or, what sort of boundaries you have. And I think it's classic, especially in mothers, since you mentioned it, but to take care of everyone else but yourself.
Yeah.
And I see it in men too, right? So I have a lot of entrepreneurs that, are clients, and they will take care, like if anything goes wrong with the business, they take care of it. But with themselves, they don't take care of themselves. And I think that's one of the biggest, most toxic relationships that we have, is the one that we have with ourselves, where we don't care and love ourselves.
I find sometimes that I will say to my patient base, I want you to be as kind to yourself as you are to your friends. Mm-hmm. And it always makes them sort of stop and pause and think, mm-hmm. Really? Like, it doesn't even register how wonderful they're going to be to their family members or their friends. But for them to stop and put that same amount of effort and just turn it towards themselves it's not a novel idea, but it somehow you get the reaction of, wait, what?
Right.
It's really fascinating. And there was a part of me that used to think that was more of a motherhood thing, and that moms are just so used to caring. But since you and I started talking about the topic of today, I realized that I saw it in my patients, and some of them are not mothers. I mean, this is the people that I did see it in were primarily female in my experience, as my radar has been more attuned to it. But I thought that was really interesting, because what I assumed was a role of motherhood, I think might also have an element of cultural norm, of this sense of not caretaking, because it's not quite so elementary, but it's more about striving for almost a sense of feeling important, or feeling vital, feeling like a necessary element to the life running smoothly. And I wonder, how much of that is almost ego. I mean, almost to the point where we get in the way because we don't want to be mortal, or you know what I mean? Because we see it. I mean, you and I see it all the time with health. We see it often with taking care of yourself. But I think, as practicing naturopaths, we're not just looking at blood cultures and urine analysis. I think, my practice specifically and very intricately involves body, mind, spirit. I mean, I will just as often have an hour-long appointment talking about gut functioning as I might of emotional stressors, or
right.
Who you're caretaking for. I mean, you can see different pathologies, of course, rear up when a spouse has a hip replacement, or, the caretaking manifestations that you see in a dis-ease or disharmony body. But I do think that finding and paying attention to the relationship that you're willing to maybe scratch and have a do-over, within yourself, to how well am I going to take care of me? I know, speaking to you recently, you're up early and you're doing yoga and you're taking care of your parts.
And that's not something that I normally do for myself.
Well, no. And that's the beauty in hearing it. I'm like, whoa, well, you've always honored yourself very well. But I think
health-wise,
I didn't mean health-wise. No, that was actually not what I was going for. I think, but hearing now that you're getting up early and you're stretching and you're getting outside and you're putting more focus on the nuts and bolts of the health, it is inspiring. And it is also, it's inspiring, but it also is one piece, because I think, I think getting out and moving and using our bodies and eating really good food is one way of helping and addressing the self-importance and loving yourself and nourishing yourself. But I think also knowing on a more ethereal level maybe, but knowing the space you take up, back to that, the light, back to, I'm going to let it shine. And with toxic relationships allowing your light. You know, as you were saying before, folks couldn't keep up with your volume. I had a friend in college who, I can't remember who the guy was, but he just sort of looked perfect. Like he was just had it all going. And I remember looking at her and thinking, she's kind of an odd bird. And I remember saying something like, why didn't that work out? And she looked at me and she goes, he could not keep up with my funness. And I remember being like, well, that takes care of him. Like, because she was allowing for her space. Mm-hmm. She was loving herself, and it was beautiful.
And that's the thing. Showering yourself with love from the universe, right? Like if you shower yourself with love, if you know your value, if you won't let people should on you or shit on you or like stir up your life with drama or make you feel like a piece of shit and like there's something wrong with you and like greet you with negativity. Like if you have a good like, nope, we can put this on pause and, you know, maybe we'll be friends again in the future. But right now, like I cannot endure this, you know, negativity on my, you know, life stage. And so getting to that point, I think we had a really good conversation yesterday when I was sharing this with you about seasons.
Yes.
There's some big things that I want to hit before we go. We only have a couple of minutes left. And one of them is seasons. And so it's like the winter and the hibernation and just like the, you know, being the seed in the soil waiting, right?
The cocoon where you put together all the pieces and you start dreaming of it, but you're just sort of still and cuddled in. And
now it's one of the first days of spring. I'm wearing my spring green, right? And now things like, I just want people to be able to open themselves up for shifts because now is the perfect time for it.
Absolutely.
And so since now is the perfect time for shifts, can you show me your feng shui corner for relationships?
I can't. For relationships?
And we'll do a whole other show about this, but it's so important because Dr. Cassio does feng shui consulting for houses so that you can like clean up and organize the energy in your house so that the energy in your health and your life is improved. And so we'll just show it quickly and we'll do a whole other show on it at another time.
Okay, instead of relationships, what I'm going to do is helpful people. Helpful people and wisdom, because I think that might be correlate a little bit more with where we are.
Okay,
so
good.
This is basically an area where you can find wisdom. This is a snapshot of what I have. And in that area, it doesn't have to be a big space. It doesn't have to be anything that takes over, but it's things that are important, and we will absolutely hit on them because I think it's really fascinating to do that. And I think I like that you brought it back to change. Feng shui the definition is the winds of change. And I think as we started this hour session, we talked about how change is so vital in friendships and being in loving relationships and allowing for there to be change, whether it's incendiary, what you might do is light somebody on fire, right? That changes things. Or maybe just more subtly pushing the
fire is the great change.
Right, it's a great change. But I think change is something that we should not be afraid of. And I think we could certainly talk more about change, but I think change and being open to seeing when things need to be changed is a vital piece of staying out of toxic relationships.
And loving yourself enough to know that if you are moving towards a healthier place for you, that's going to be so much better in the long run. And you are worth it.
We all are. Absolutely.
So if you're interested in doing feng shui consulting with Dr. Cassio, you can message me on Facebook and I will put you in contact with her and give you her email address. It's drcassio@yahoo.com.
It is.
CASCIO, drcascio@yahoo.com if you want that feng shui consulting. And this has been the Bad Girls Guide to Living Well. Thank you for tuning in. We'll see you next week at 10 Pacific Standard Time, where we are doing a show about the spiritual aspects of healing. So thank you, Dr. Cassio, for being on here.
Thanks for having me.
It was great.
You've been listening to the Bad Girls Guide to Living Well.
Oh, right. Good show.
Thanks.